Welcome to Business Better, a Ballard Spahr podcast designed to help businesses navigate the new normal. I'm Brendan Collins. I'm the leader of Ballard Spahr's Manufacturing and Consumer Products Industry Group and also a partner in the firm's Environment and Natural Resources Group. Today's podcast show is part of our Manufacturing Moment series, where we will discuss issues important to the manufacturing industry. Today, we're talking about an issue that has been in and out of the political discourse on a regular rhythm: permit reform. Our guest is Michael Davin, Senior Director, Energy and Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks, Brendan. Appreciate you having me.
Michael, I'd like you to start by telling our audience a little bit about yourself and your history in the organization and the organization itself.
Absolutely, Brendan. Really appreciate this. So I'm Mike Davin, Senior Director of Energy and Resources Policy here at the National Association of Manufacturers. I've been here at the NAM for 2.5 years, having been in DC since 2013. Before coming here, I worked on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress for 10 years. His name's Congressman Bob Latta from Ohio, focused mainly on energy and environment issues, and that really gave me the opportunity to understand what is important to manufacturers when it comes to energy, to protecting the environment, to trying to get shovels in the ground, and how to make good policy that is good for our local communities. So it really set me up for this new opportunity where I was able to come and work for the NAM to get the larger industry perspective. For those that don't know, the National Association of Manufacturers, it's one of the oldest trade associations in the United States. It was founded in 1895, and we represent 13 million people who work in manufacturing in the United States. These are the people who make things. We have thousands of members of companies. We have thousands of member companies, including over 200 members who sit on our board of directors. If you go online and look at our board of directors list, you'll see many recognizable names and brands from historic roots in the American economy, like Johnson & Johnson, U.S. Steel, ExxonMobil, Smuckers, Rockwell Automation. A lot of our members also are on the small and medium size. They actually make up 90% of our membership, and these are the companies that are less than $1 billion in annual revenue. We also have mutually beneficial partnerships with organizations like law firms and CPA advisories. So we're very proud to partner with Ballard Spahr as one of our members here. Additionally, we do have what's called our Council of Manufacturing Associations. So these are over 260 vertical manufacturing trade associations that represent specific parts of the economy. So think, API for oil and gas, or think, your semiconductor manufacturers. They all are also our partners. And then we do have representation in all 50 states with state partnerships, whether it's the local chambers of commerce for those states or the local manufacturing associations. So it really allows us to be plugged into what's going on in the communities for our members, since we are a national organization. Our CEO, Jay Timmons, he likes to talk about how the NAM is really focused on policy, not politics, personality, or processes. Being able to engage on policy allows us to really get in and work with policymakers on both sides of the aisle and be in the room to help influence decisions that would impact our industry. The manufacturing brand is very popular with both sides of the aisle because, these are the businesses that really help the local communities thrive and create jobs and provide that local flavor for helping folks succeed. So because we are a national organization and because policy is our bread and butter, we've put together a robust team of policy subject matter experts that work on a variety of issues. So while I do energy and natural resources policy, we also have folks who handle tax, trade, healthcare, technology policy, corporate finance, anything you can really think of that, the government could be making policy on, we try to cover those areas for our members and provide that expertise so that, if you're a small mom and pop that doesn't have the resources to be able to have a government affairs shop, we're here to be that government affairs shop for you.
Well, it's a tremendous organization. We've had the privilege to be involved with it for a number of years and partnered on different events. And I'm very grateful that you're here with us today, Mike. So as we turn the discussion to permit reform, can you set the table for us by giving us kind of a high-level overview of, well, frankly, what do people mean when they talk about permit reform? And what are the key reasons that people think it's so essential for the business community?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, we've been really focusing on a comprehensive manufacturing strategy. So we needing all these policy areas to work together to really allow the manufacturing sector to grow in the United States. And, a part of that is fair and common sense trade practices, competitive and permanent tax policies, balanced regulatory and sensible regulatory environment that provides certainty. And then also, what we talk about is energy dominance and streamlined permitting reform. So last year, to set the stage, Congress and this administration, they passed and signed into law legislation. It's called H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's, the rolls off the tongue, that moniker. But what that bill did was provide that certainty and competitive tax structure that our members were looking for. It provided permanency on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed back in 2017, and included a lot of other great pro-manufacturing tax policies. So, the table is set. We have what we need on the tax side. So now it's up to us in the manufacturing industry to start to use the resources that Congress and this administration has given us and put shovels in the ground, start creating jobs, start expanding. And we really want to do that. The issue has been the permitting process that our companies have to go through to be able to do that. So whether it's a clean air permit that you need to get to, decide, if what your operations are doing are going to affect air emissions, if it's a Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, a National Historic Preservation Act, or if you need to get an environmental review for your project to see what your impact would be on the environment, all of these different statutes are working where members have to and companies have to go and obtain a permit, or at least go through a process to be able to prove that their project will not adversely impact their local communities or the environment. And to be clear, our members, they're more than willing to go through a process to do this. But what we've found over the years is that these historic statutes have not been updated in decades. And so they don't take into account the modern economy. They don't take into account improvements in the environment. And they don't take into account some of these other exceptional events that would be the real root of the problem, and not necessarily what our members are doing. Because they've been able to improve their technologies, they've become more efficient in what they're doing, and so they've reduced their footprint, but they still have to go through these processes. And so, it's concerning when the United States, it takes 80% longer to go through a permitting process than it does to a comparable economy, a comparable free market economy around the world. I know I've heard one stat about if you want to permit a mine in the United States. I know, critical minerals, that's a huge issue this year. It seems to be the buzzword that the administration, Congress, everyone is interested in. And so if you want to permit just a mine, it could take upwards of 2 decades or more to go from the beginning of the project to actual operation. China's not waiting that long to permit their mines, to process materials. They are going full speed ahead. And so, what we want to do is find some common sense ways that we can maintain those protections on the environment while also, being able to allow members and manufacturers to go through and start their projects and start to grow and create jobs.
Thank you for that overview. Are there specific asks that you hear commonly or that the NAM is speaking about in the political discourse?
Yeah, I mean, we did a report back in the beginning of this year where we surveyed our membership to find out, what are the issues they're seeing, where are the delays, how much is it costing them, and we tried to quantify that. And we did this report with our partners at the Foundation for American Innovation. This report's called America on Hold. Feel free to go to nam.org and search America on Hold, and you'll be able to read it in full. But so that report found that our members and manufacturers are seeing costs of upwards of $8 billion per year due to permitting delays. So that's money that's not being spent on hiring workers, expanding shop floors, or going back into the local economy. What we found is that going back to the certainty piece and being able to predict the process that a company has to go through, our members want to make sure that any routine changes to permits will be routine again. You shouldn't have to go through a whole new arduous process just because you make slight modifications to your facilities, especially if it doesn't result in emissions. Making those timelines predictable. If you're told that this process should take 2 years, then it should take 2 years. For some of our smaller companies that don't necessarily have the compliance departments, predictability and understanding the process is important in their long-term planning for understanding where they need to spend the money to go through the process. And the longer it takes and the more delays, the more money it will cost some of these folks. Also, to be honest, on the judicial and litigation side, our members, they want to be good stewards of the community, and they are working to engage communities on their projects and the impact of their projects. But we've seen instances in the past of some of these projects being stopped at the very last minute from some outside group that comes in and sues and tries to stop it. We think there are common sense ways that you can put some guardrails in on who can be involved in litigation, when decisions have to be made, and ultimately, what is that light at the end of the tunnel so that, companies don't have to worry about, litigation on every single step of their project. So, and then, I think a big piece that we've been seeing a lot in recent months and especially here in DC is the certainty around permits. If you have, gone through the process, you legally obtained your permit, you should be able to proceed with your project without fear of it being pulled back or put under question or under review just because of the type of project it is. And I think this cuts, both sides. We're completely agnostic about, the projects themselves. It's that project certainty and permit certainty that our members are really looking for. Now, these changes, they'll benefit everyone. They'll benefit, your traditional manufacturers, advanced manufacturers, like our friends in the semiconductor industry, our energy producers and grid component manufacturers. These are the people who are, working overtime to help our nation meet growing, energy demand. And we found that this administration, they have, taken the ball and run with it on the administrative side. They've tried to do seemingly everything in their power to enact permit reform through the administrative branch, the executive branch. But for us, I think there's a problem with what we've seen over the past 10, 15 years of when a new administration comes in, does that pendulum swing the other way? And a lot of these good reforms could be rolled back or reversed. And so we need a more comprehensive, durable solution to make sure we don't lose these gains. And so that's why we are very engaged with Congress to try and get something passed this year. We think now's the time, now's the opportunity. And, the longer we wait, the further, we fall behind China and others. And some of these really interesting, innovative advancements, AI, advanced manufacturing, as I said, on the semiconductor side, and other really cool technologies. So that's why we're focusing so much this year to make sure our members can get those shovels in the ground.
Right. It's a natural follow on for some of the elements of the tax reform that occurred last year. There's better treatment of capital investment. And, now we want to make sure that the capital investment that the capital gets invested before those changes lapse or are amended. Listen, candidly, I'm not sure I really agree that the administration has been useful in the permitting reform space. Obviously, the administration has been easing some restrictions in ways that may or may not survive litigation challenge. It's also been attacking permits that are already in hand in certain types of energy disfavored by the Whitehouse. But also, the staff cuts to EPA aren't really helping anybody get projects reviewed and through. So, to the point about how we've done so far with this administration, well, reasonable people can differ. But I think what your last point was, Mike, was that administrations are 4 years at a time, or maybe 8, and to have a certain consistent course correction that people can count on, that legislative help is likely necessary. I mean, after all, I think one of your early comments here was that we're dealing with some very old environmental statutes that were adopted in the 1970s, and last amended Clean Air Act was last substantially amended in 1990. So we do have difficulty revisiting these statutes in a coherent and productive way, because generations have gone by since some of these statutes were amended. So let's talk about Congress and what you see as the debate that's shaping up. We've heard, concerns about what vehicles are going to be used in a legislative sense, but I really just want to get to sort of the substance a bit. Like, what concepts is there bipartisan agreement on? What concepts are potential stumbling blocks to bipartisan agreement? Where do you think, what's the current state of play in Congress on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to the certainty piece, and I think our friends in Congress, they fully recognize what has been going on, and they're trying to come around to an agreement that would enshrine in statute that certainty, because whether it was the Keystone XL pipeline under President Obama and President Biden, or what we're seeing on the wind and solar side with this administration, we at the NAM are again, technology agnostic. We think we need all energy. We need an all the above strategy that focuses on, your traditional oil, your oil and natural gas, nuclear, renewables, hydro, geothermal is really an exciting space. We also think you can use energy more efficiently, rather than just focusing on the production side. You can use more energy efficient technologies and products. And so I think Congress gets that. And you have Shelley Capito. She is the senior senator from West Virginia. She is also the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. She is kind of the lead negotiator here, trying to find a deal with her counterpart, Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. They are also working together with the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. That's Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. So, we feel like these four working together, there is a desire to get a deal. There is a recognition that, permit reform is not just for oil and gas. It's also for renewable energy. It's also for transmission. It's also for boosting energy infrastructure, not just pipelines, but, wires. So getting able to interconnect all of these generation facilities is important to everyone. And I think the Democratic colleagues have recognized that. And that's why you have someone who is so staunchly, pro-environment and has been working with advocates in the environmental space like Sheldon, Whitehouse, willing to come to the table and try and find a deal. And so there was some concern late last year when some particular wind and solar projects were either put on hold or delayed or canceled because of some administrative action. And that's why Sheldon, Whitehouse, and Martin Heinrich walked away from the table. After a few months of talking and trying to work things out, they have come back to the table. The Department of Interior is reviewing solar projects again. And so they are negotiating and trying to get to a final product. I know that there has also been some concern of late about what the Department of Defense, Department of War is doing when it comes to certain onshore wind projects and concerns about national security. And so that continues to be an open question about how that will impact the permitting reform talks. But generally, there is a desire to get something done. You have Senator Barrasso. He is in Republican leadership in the Senate. He has introduced his own legislation on permitting reform. Senator Alan Armstrong, I know, is very interested in permitting reform. He's from Oklahoma. He's the newest senator, and he comes from an industrial background in energy policy. You have Senator McCormick from Pennsylvania, but then you also have, the two senators from Colorado, the senators from Nevada, the Democratic senators who are also interested in engaging here, and also the two senators from Arizona, Senator Kelly and Senator Gallego. They do have those advanced manufacturing facilities and projects in their state, and they want to see those succeed. And so I think the numbers are there. It's just, can they come to an agreement and depending on what's in the bill, can they sell that to their wider caucus?
Yeah. And is there similar or parallel effort in the House, or is this really just a Senate-led process at this point?
Yeah, we were very grateful to Chairman Bruce Westerman. He is the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. Late last year, he was able to work through the House what he's calling the SPEED Act. The purpose of that bill is to address some of those concerns around NEPA. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. These are the environmental impact statement issues about, if a project, has to get approved, then it has to get an environmental impact statement. So his legislation would address those guardrails I talked about on the judicial reform, judicial review side, addressing timelines, addressing statutes of limitation, and really trying to streamline the process, make sure community input is still involved, while also making sure that at the end of the day there is a light at the end of the tunnel for manufacturers and companies looking for environmental reviews. So that passed. It did have some bipartisan support, which we were grateful for. There was also a bill called the Permit Act, which came out of the House around the same time. That was more on clean water reform, Clean Water Act reforms. So we think that the House effort was, the opening gambit to provide at least a vehicle, or when I say a vehicle, I mean a legislative vehicle, to show where the House stands on an issue. And then the Senate, they could amend those bills. They can produce a bill of their own. They can take the language and incorporate that into one of their bills, and then move forward from there. So the House also acted on a few Clean Air Act reform bills, which we are supportive of. But I think the Clean Air Act seems to be a bigger hill to climb when it comes to this overall permit reform discussion in the Senate. It's not out of the realm of possibility, and we would like to see some reforms to the Clean Air Act, especially around non-attainment issues and the NAAQS program. It's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Program. Again, this is all for, trying to obtain a permit, and if your project would put the area that you're operating in into attainment of a standard or out of attainment of a standard, that would impact your ability to get the permit. And so we've looked for reforms in that program, but it's unclear, what's in the realm of the possible in the Senate.
Is there more? You had mentioned that one of the challenges that project developers face is litigation, and I have spent many, many years as an advocate for projects that were energy projects, in particular generation facilities and things like that, where litigation never stopped the project, but the uncertainty that goes along with litigation was really had a crippling effect on financing and other issues with respect to some of the products with which I've been involved. And so I really am empathetic to the notion that we can address the vulnerability of projects to, what are not, to challenges that simply drag on and on and on. And particularly when in the air context, in which, once you have a permit, you have to begin construction in 18 months, and you do that against the backdrop of litigation, you're putting a lot of capital at risk. Even if there isn't what I'll call sort of substantive change to the Clean Air Act in the cards right now, based upon the political landscape, do you think there is a possibility for addressing just the litigation issue on the Clean Air Act, or are you concerned that the whole Clean Air Act is going to be left behind in this effort at permit reform?
It's really tough because the margins being what they are in the House, when I say margins, the seat margins of Republicans and Democrats, I think there is more leeway to at least examine some of these issues on the Senate side. But the House, at least the Democratic caucus, has shown little appetite for even touching the Clean Air Act. And so aside from, I believe there are anywhere from 7 to 9 Democrats who voted for some of these bills in the past couple of months. But beyond that, it's tough to see something getting done. Now, I think there is an argument to be made that, reforming some of these legal issues, no matter what the statute is in the interest of Democrats as well as Republicans, as I said earlier. And so, we've been talking and having discussions about that, because I think some of these projects that they would like, for example, in Arizona, they have difficulty with attainment issues under the Clean Air Act and the emission standards. But if you want to bring back semiconductor manufacturing from Taiwan and overseas, it's a national security issue. It's not just an economic issue. You have to contend with the Clean Air Act. And so, I think there are Democrats who get that, and, it's trying to make that case. But it's an uphill battle, I think, and even opening up the Clean Air Act a little bit when you are also opening up at the same time these other historic statutes like Clean Water Act and NEPA. And, Chairman Lee from Utah, he is very interested in getting reforms on national historic preservation and endangered species. Those are additional historic statutes. So I think what they're doing, the negotiators, they almost have two side-by-side lists, and they're trying to weigh, if we give this, what do we get in return? And where's that balance? And, what are you giving up to be able to get that? And so it's becoming a numbers game and a trading game, and we'll see what happens. But that's the other thing too. We could be sitting here in a month and they include reforms to the Clean Air Act in their bill that they released. That this process has been very closed, and they're trying to get to a deal by hammering it out behind closed doors. We have some idea about what they could touch on, and we've been talking with our friends in the House and also with staff in the Senate, and so we have some idea. But ultimately, the devil is going to be in the details when we see the legislative text.
So the summer's before us, the midterms are before us, all of the efforts to reach an agreement behind closed doors, as you say, in the Senate are ongoing now. What should we look for in terms of a timeline going forward? Should we be looking at the Speed Act and the Permit Act out of the House last session to kind of frame out a menu of the possible elements and look for the Senate to include as many of them as possible in some sort of new bill?
Yeah, I think the timeline here, in a rosy timeline, I think, something released before the August recess. Typically, Congress goes out for the month of August to do a working period back in their districts or their states where they travel around and meet with constituents and host events, town halls. They go into different businesses and tour their facilities. So the month of August is, completely shut down here in DC. Staff might be in or out. So I think any type of serious negotiating, if they want to get something done quickly, which is, I know, the Republicans want to get something out as soon as they have the deal. The thought is that they would have something out in the next couple of weeks. I will also say a little bit about Congress and the wonkiness that they have, every term. So every 2 years, there seems to be a handful of what we call must pass pieces of legislative vehicles. So something that gets attached to it that has to pass that Congress by a certain date, or else funding runs out or programs expire. And so they become very attractive targets for members of Congress to try and attach their piece of legislation to, because they know at the end of the day, whether it's September 30th or December 31st, that bill has to move, and so they can get their priority, because the odds of getting a standalone bill, all the way through Congress, through the House, through the Senate, and to the president's desk, it has to be very non-controversial or overwhelmingly bipartisan and popular. Otherwise, these things get folded into the appropriations process, which funds the government from October 1st to September 30th. There's the National Defense Authorization Act. That is the annual bill that Congress has passed, dating back to the 1950s, that lays out the priorities and, goals for our defense community every single year. While the name says defense, that bill has become increasingly a vehicle for other pieces of legislation. And then finally, this year, there is what's called the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. So several years ago, Congress passed, they do this every 5 years. It is an update to the authorization and the funding for our infrastructure programs. So think the Highway Trust Fund, transit, rail, ports, all of these modes get their funding and authorization through a surface transportation bill. So the last one was 5 years ago. It expires at the end of this fiscal year. And so that has become the natural discussion point about adding permitting reform language to that bill. Surface transportation itself, the bill that's in various states right now, it's states of Congress. There is a bill in the House. There is pieces of a bill in the Senate. But again, it all has to come together, and there has to be agreement from everyone to be able to add it and then ultimately have that vote on it. So permitting reform language could be done by August. More realistically, if it does get attached to surface transportation, it would be a September play. But then, as you pointed out, this is a midterm year. There's a lot of opinions about what Congress should or should not be focusing on. Do they even have the time, or to my point earlier about the margins, do they even have the votes in the House for some of this stuff, or does it all get punted to after the November elections? So worst case scenario of something actually getting done would be by the end of the year, but it's our goal to get something done as quickly as possible. That if it's good policy, we want it to move so that we can start, giving that certainty to our members so that they can start investing and growing.
Thanks very much, Michael. We really appreciate all of these insights on the process. But before we go, do you have any closing thoughts?
Thanks, Brendan. And we're talking a lot about how, this is permitting reform is important for manufacturing, for expanding operations, for, adding jobs. I think one piece that's really important too, especially in this election year, is everyone's talking about energy affordability and being able to keep energy prices low or at least, within reason. We've seen international events in the Middle East impact energy prices. There's the ongoing debates about data centers and just the increase in energy demand and what that is doing. And so we've kind of come across this issue as, now's the time to enact permitting reform so that we can, again, to my point, get more energy production, more generation, build out our infrastructure to get these electrons across the country. One of the biggest issues is having access to affordable energy, whether you're in the Northeast or elsewhere, in the country. So we think now's the time for Congress to really seize the opportunity. If they do want to address energy affordability, permitting reform is key to doing that.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm very grateful that you were able to join us today. And on behalf of all the manufacturing clients out there, we thank you for your continued work on their behalf. Well, once again, we're grateful to Michael Davin, Senior Director for Energy and Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, for being our guest today. Make sure to visit our website, www.ballardspar.com, where you can find the latest news and guidance from our attorneys. Subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the show, please email podcast@ballardspar.com. There will be some links below to the National Association of Manufacturers and to that report that Michael mentioned in our call. And with that, we'll leave you. Thank you for listening.